Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how big, terrible events can change the way people feel? Not just in the moment, but for a long time after. Well, this new study might have a clue. This paper looks at what happened to people in Israel after the terrible attacks on the 7th of October 2023. It's a tough topic, but it's about understanding how big shared traumas affect our minds, especially when we're already feeling a bit down or stressed. What they found is pretty surprising. The biggest change wasn't more fear or stress, but a kind of numbness, a loss of feeling, especially when it comes to wanting to do things. So what is collective trauma? Think of it as a big bad event that hits a whole group of people all at once, like a war, a huge natural disaster, or sadly, a terrorist attack. These events don't just hurt the people right there, they shake up how everyone in the community feels safe and why they think things happen. Most studies about these kinds of events focus on the immediate panic and fear, kind of like post-traumatic stress, but this research wanted to look deeper, at the feelings that stick around longer like sadness and a lack of spark. The researchers were curious if certain kinds of sadness, a specific way of feeling down, might be more common after a big shared trauma. They pointed to something called anhedonia. This is basically the inability to feel pleasure or joy. But it is more than just not enjoying things. It also includes things like not feeling motivated to start tasks or just not feeling enthusiastic about anything anymore. They also mentioned demoralization, which is a feeling of hopelessness and the loss of meaning in life. The researchers brought up an interesting idea called the conservation of resources theory. It suggests that when bad things happen, we might get stressed and anxious, which is like our body telling us to get ready to act. But when we actually lose important things like safety or trust in our community, we tend to withdraw and become depressed, rather than getting energized. It's like our internal gas tank for coping gets drained. Now, the big event in this study is the 7th of October attack. It was particularly awful because it wasn't just an external threat. It felt like a violation of home, a place where people should feel safe. This, combined with the ongoing uncertainty about hostages and national safety, created a really unstable feeling for the whole country. Previous studies looked at the general population and found a big jump in all kinds of distress after the 7th of October. But this study wanted to look at people who were already seeking help for psychological issues. They thought of this as a natural laboratory, by comparing people who asked for help before the attacks to those who asked for help after. They could see if the trauma did something specific to people who were already struggling, or if it just made everyone feel worse across the board. To do this, they used a common questionnaire called the Depression Anxiety Stress Scales, or DAS-21. It's great because it doesn't just measure overall distress. It breaks it down into three main parts: depression, anxiety, and stress. They wanted to see if the post-attack group would have higher scores in all three, or if one would stand out. So, how did they do it? They gathered information from over 1,000 adults in Israel who were looking for psychological help. Importantly, they looked at who filled out their surveys before the 7th of October, and who filled them out after. It was about 382 people before and about 696 people after. The groups were pretty similar in terms of gender and age, which is good for comparing them. They collected data from December 2022 all the way to January 2026. So, they had a good chunk of people who answered the questions before the attacks and a much larger group who answered them in the months that followed during the ongoing crisis. Now, what did they find? This is where it gets really interesting. When they compared the two groups, those who sought help before the 7th of October and those who sought help after, they found a significant difference in depression scores. The people who sought help after the 7th of October had higher depression scores. But here is the kicker: there was no significant difference in anxiety or stress levels between the two groups. This is the opposite of what they initially expected, as they thought all distress measures would go up. It wasn't just a general feeling of being worse, it was specifically depression that increased. To really dig into this, they looked at each individual question on the DAS-21 scale. This is where they found out why depression was higher. It wasn't due to general sadness, but specifically to anhedonic symptoms, the loss of pleasure and motivation. Two specific questions really stood out. It was hard to work up the initiative to do things, and I was unable to become enthusiastic about anything. These were the main drivers of the increased depression scores. So, people weren't just sadder, they had a harder time getting started on tasks and felt less excited about life. This points to a real depletion of their motivation and drive. They also looked at how severe the depression was. Before the 7th of October, about 36.9% of people were in the extremely severe depression category. After the attacks, this number jumped to 45%. That is a significant increase in the number of people experiencing very serious depression. Interestingly, when they looked at the relationships between depression, anxiety, and stress, they found that these relationships didn't change. It wasn't like trauma rewired how these feelings connect. Instead, it just turned up the volume on specific depressive symptoms, particularly the ones related to motivation and enthusiasm. So, what does all this mean? The researchers are suggesting that collective trauma, especially one that feels so deeply personal and violating like the 7th of October attacks, doesn't just make people generally more anxious or stressed. Instead, it can lead to a specific kind of depression, a depression characterized by a loss of agency, a feeling of being stuck, and a draining of personal motivation. Think of it as a depletion of your get up and go and your excitement power. They explain that anxiety and stress are like alarm bells that push us to act, to fight, or flee. But this kind of depression, this anhedonia, is different. It's a collapse of motivation. It's not that people are necessarily terrified in the short term, but that their ability to engage with life, to set goals, and to find pleasure is severely hampered. This fits with the idea that when foundational resources like safety and trust are shattered, people tend to withdraw. The researchers did consider if maybe the anxiety and stress scores were already so high before the attacks that there was just no room for them to go up. But they looked at the numbers, and that wasn't the case. Anxiety and stress weren't maxed out. This makes their finding about depression even more striking. This is a really important point for anyone involved in mental health care, especially after big disasters. If depression with anhedonia, that loss of motivation and enthusiasm, is the main problem, then standard approaches that focus heavily on anxiety might not be enough. They suggest that treatments like behavioral activation, which encourages people to do things even when they don't feel like it, and meaning-centered approaches, which help people find purpose, could be especially helpful. Now, like any study, this one has its limitations. For example, it is a cross-sectional study, meaning they looked at data from different points in time but didn't follow the same people over a long period. This means they can't definitively say the trauma caused the change, only that there was a change associated with it. Also, the period after the 7th of October was really long and difficult, encompassing ongoing war and uncertainty. So it's not just about an acute reaction, but a sustained trauma. And remember, they studied people who were already seeking help. These findings might not apply to the general population in the same way. They also didn't ask about how much direct exposure people had to the trauma, or if they were displaced. The effect size, which is a measure of how strong the effect is, was small. But the researchers point out that for people already struggling and seeking help, even a small increase in depression and anhedonia can have a big impact on their lives and on mental health services. So, to wrap it all up, this study gives us a really important insight into the psychological aftermath of collective trauma. It suggests that for people already prone to distress, a major traumatic event can lead to a specific kind of depression. A depression marked by a loss of the will to act, a fading of enthusiasm, and a general depletion of motivation. This reminds us that in times of crisis, we need to be ready to support not just the fear and anxiety, but also the profound sense of numbness and loss of purpose it can bring. I think this research highlights how complex our responses to trauma can be. It's easy to assume everyone just gets more scared, but this paper shows us that sometimes the deepest impact is a quiet withdrawal, a loss of the spark that makes life worth living. It really emphasizes the need for mental health services to be flexible and target these specific symptoms of motivational depletion. What do you all think about these findings? Does this resonate with anything you've experienced or observed? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.